Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending our webinar, The Future of Finance with Workday, Record to Report today and tomorrow. We are very excited to have with us today Joe Finuti from Bill Gosling. This webinar is part of a series called Looking Forward with Workday, each of which are designed to give you insight into how you can do more with Workday. A few tips around how to get the most out of the webinar today. On the right-hand side of the webinar console, you will see content related to today's webinar, as well as links to our schedule of upcoming webinars. We've got a lot more in the works for you. At the bottom of the screen is a gray bar also with multiple application widgets so you can sort of customize, resize, move things around so that you can get comfortable in the space, leverage it as you like. We also have quite a few people logged in, and so all attendees are muted, but we certainly encourage you to ask questions at any time using the Q&A widget, and we will do our best to either address them throughout the webinar or we will have them in the Q&A portion towards the end of the session. If for some reason we don't get to your questions, we will absolutely follow up with you via email after the webinar. We are also recording this webinar. It will be available on demand probably about a week later. We will have some forward-looking statements, as do many of our forward-looking vision type of material. So please consider that those forward-looking statements are under our Safe Harbor Agreement. And so thanks for joining us. I am Sam Buchner. I am part of the product marketing organization here at Workday within the financials group. And I am, as I mentioned, very excited to welcome Joe Finuti, Chief Financial Officer for Bill Gosling. Joe, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, Bill Gosling, as well?
Yeah, sure. Joe Finuti, Bill Gosling. We're a call center solutions company headquartered out of Toronto, Canada. A little bit about us. We've been in business for about 50 years, and we run a number of call center programs for various clients globally. A little bit about me. I'm a CPA CA out of Canada. Started off my career at KPMG, worked in various finance capacities for McDonald's, Mars, and Virgin Mobile, as well as a couple of smaller tech companies. So seen different sectors and have been at Bill Gosling for about 10 years as the CFO.
Fabulous. Thanks so much. If you're familiar with Workday, these stats may be things you've heard before. If you're new to Workday, welcome. We have been in business since 2005. We're based out of Pleasanton, California. We have about 11,000 employees worldwide, and we are focused on positioning enterprise cloud applications around financials, HR, planning, analytics. Today, we're going to focus specifically on financials, and so let's get into it. I'm going to walk you through the agenda. We're going to start with some market insights, and then we're going to get right into the journey to the future, what the record process is today and where it's going. I'm going to have Joe share his point of view as well as share how Workday is investing to build on that, to continue to drive value. And then we'll open it up to Q&A at the end. So let's get started. So the first piece, when we think about market insights that's coming up regularly is just the sheer amount of disruption, right? And I think historically, disruption was viewed as something to be careful about, something to monitor, something to watch for. And the change that we're seeing from some market research, this specifically from KPMG, is that no longer are people or companies waiting for disruption. In fact, they're leaning into it. And so 95% of CEOs today from this survey from KPMG are seeing it as an opportunity, a necessary opportunity. To do that, to act on that, you have to be agile. And so the similar group, 59%, are seeing that agility is the new currency of business. If you're not able to be agile, there's obviously risk associated with that. And more than just seeing it as an opportunity, companies and CEOs are looking at how can they actively disrupt this, right? This is obviously a big departure from the record to report process, but it's connected, and we'll talk about why that is. The reason is to disrupt, to be agile, you've got to overcome some of the internal constraints that you may be dealing with. If you think about the record to report process and where there are some shortfalls, they can prevent you from looking forward, prevent you from transforming. And so you get into issues of data quality, ineffective data aggregation, lack of automation, so lots of manual effort, lots of time needed to close periods, as well as challenges in reporting. And so all of that insight, all of that efficiency is lost. Time is being spent in these manual areas that could be focused on how can you help an organization disrupt, because the CEOs are, of course, looking to finance to help with that. But what we're seeing as well is these are not going away. If you've invested in making incremental change, that's not necessarily rethinking how you're operating. So those internal constraints will remain, those external pressures will remain, and it's only going to become more cumbersome and more challenging in the future because we know we're continuing to operate in more matrix environments. There's new market pressures coming in all the time, new regulation. And so the point we're trying to make is that by solving for things like the way you're operating, the efficiency, you're going to get the time back that you need to address those external pressures, to look at how to disrupt most effectively. The other point to make as well is when you set up your organization to be more agile and to lean in disruption, you can do that by investing in a digital back office. And more than just innovating and changing the way you work, there's lots of value potential to be created. And so research shows that by investing in digital technologies, you can reduce cost to finance. And so for those companies from our recent Hackett Group research that invested in things like robotic process automation, machine learning, cognitive intelligence, they were able to reduce costs by up to 60%. And when you look at the business case, when you look at the value creation potential associated with that for a $1 billion company on average, we are looking at finance being able to drive $130 million in shareholder value. So the idea of leaning into disruption, thinking about ways to automate that record to report process can lead to significant value potential for finance. Joe, I'm curious as to your thoughts here on creating value and by investing digitally and solving for that record to report process challenge I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to what's the mandate of finance. So traditionally, the mandate of finance has been a scorekeeping role, providing information to the organization, providing some variance analysis. But increasingly, what I think needs to happen is that finance really needs to be a catalyst to change. How does finance disseminate financial information to operational decision makers so that they can make good decisions? Ultimately, it isn't just reporting the data, it's providing context and content in a way that the organization can drive efficient decisions so to increase shareholder value. Like at the end of the day, if I look at myself, my mandate as a CFO really is to create capital, not just count it.
That's great. And so thinking about how to take this on, to take on that more strategic role, to not just count the capital, but help create it, I think that leads us into this concept of balancing the traditional with the strategic. So you've got to have that mastery of the record to report process to allow for more time on the strategic. And another point of research in working with Longitude is that the companies that have become the most strategic are those that have mastered that record to report process. They're 2 times more effective. They've also been able to lower the cost of finance by 43% and then employ 45% fewer FTEs. That doesn't mean that those FTEs went away. That means those FTEs have been redeployed on that strategic area of the business. So again, by mastering that record to report process, that allows for so much more time and so much more emphasis on strategy. So how do we do this, right? How do we make this possible? Because you may be scratching your head like, how do we get started, right? And so we look at 3 core things for companies, for finance teams that are looking at how to lean into disruption. There's a lot of talk around the changing landscape of talent within financials. And so, of course, not only as you look at more strategic value-added activities, and optimizing that back office, you need the talent that can not only be more analytically, they need to have more focus on the analytics, they need to be able to interpret big data, they also need a grasp of business. They need to understand the business acumen. And so by investing in either new talent, changing your recruiting strategies, and investing in the talent that you have, that is key as you get ready to lean into disruption. The second point is the talent that you're bringing in, they need a technology foundation that can help you automate that record to report process. So it's not just separate technology that will allow you to add in new pieces. It's helping to redefine and reshape that record to report process to give you that time back. Because that, again, can be that barrier to leaning into this disruption. And having those two critical pieces together is what will set you up to master that traditional area of the business. And so the bottom line is, by being able to handle both the strategic and the traditional, you're able to run a more lean, agile organization that gets you out of a 10 to 15-day close process and into one that's much more manageable for the entire organization and allows finance to be starting that journey towards strategy. And so let's look at this sort of traditional finance model. Maybe many of you are familiar with this. It's sort of a representation of time and the traditional areas of focus where finance is spending the bulk of the time transaction processing. So this is where that record to report process comes in. Slightly less time on reporting and compliance, so we know that is key, and even less time on insight and action. This is the traditional model that we're seeing. But interestingly, as trends in technology and talent continue to evolve, we're seeing, as we talked about, this balance, right, of time spent across these core areas. As you look at investing in talent, that can be more oriented around analytics. As you look at investing in technology, that balance starts to become possible. So you can see almost an even split. Where we see this going in the future, both from an investment in talent and a technology perspective, is that this pyramid of traditional finance can become inverted, so that the transaction processing becomes the smallest portion of the heavy lifting that your team is doing, and instead the heavy emphasis is on the insight and action. That doesn't mean that those processes went away. It means that they were automated. We'll talk about what that looks like, but this is where we're seeing the future of finance headed to help really streamline that back office record to report process. So let's get into that in particular, and we want to pull the group on the line with a couple of questions to get a sense for how this is working for you all today. The first poll will pop up is, how long is the close process that you are running today? Is it 0 to 5 days, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, or over 15? And we'll give you a couple of seconds to respond. Just simply hit one of the options and submit, and then we'll post the results in a minute. I'll give you 5 more seconds. And okay, let's see what we have. 0 to 5 days, about 33%. That's actually quite good. That's 5 to 10 days, looks like 50%, so some opportunity there. And then a little bit less on the higher end of the spectrum. But don't worry, there's lots of opportunity and we'll talk about how to get through this in a minute. But certainly lots of areas of improvement, and some of you are already doing quite well. Joe, what would you say your time to close is today?
Today, we've got early stage financials by, say, day 3, so I already know what our financials look like. By the time it's all said and done, we do our formal P&L reviews. That's sitting down with the CEO and the country heads. We're probably 5 to 6 days in. So we're pretty quick in terms of our close. So it looks like the audience has got some pretty efficient close processes. But I think maybe the next question is how much effort do you take to get there is an important one, because that's, I think, where you begin to see how much time does it really take you to do, and how much effort do you expend. Yeah.
That's exactly a perfect segue into our next polling question, which is the effort. So second polling question that we'll pose to you all is, what's your effort spent doing analysis at month end versus just the recording and the reporting? So 10%, 20, 30, 40, 50% spent on that analysis on month end versus the recording and reporting. So we're trying to get engaged there. So we'll give you a couple of additional seconds. And we'll go.
Yeah, and this is really human effort. So how much human effort are you taking in terms of personnel to do analysis versus the actual reporting?
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Okay, interesting. 10% spent on the analysis, 20%, 40, 50. Yeah, so it's a good mix actually. I think we'd all like to see more time spent on analysis. That's the end goal. So, Joe, what would you say your team is doing today on the time spent on the analysis?
Yeah, we're north of 50 right now. If I look at the entire finance team in terms of where they spend their time, we're north of 50% doing analysis. We really focused on automating the close process, and we'll talk about it a little bit later.
Yeah.
But the key for us, our mandate was to get to that analysis level, to be that co-pilot versus custodian role within the organization.
Got it. Okay, let's dig in then. Speaking of that role, what we want to do next is go through the way Workday is articulated is actually a 3-step journey to the future. We'll hear Joe's point of view too. He's got one additional step in there, so it'll be, I think, interesting for the group to see how we are all looking at this future of finance. But the first piece is, where are companies today? And this is the traditional stewardship role of many organizations, so that they are kind of back to that original pyramid that I showed earlier. That's the traditional model, right? The bulk of the time is spent on that transaction processing, then siloed reporting, static planning, and so this is kind of perpetuating the focus, the traditional stewardship. Joe, I want to ask you, this was, where you were ahead of coming to Workday. What were some of the business challenges you were experiencing when you were kind of in that role of traditional stewardship?
Yeah, so organizationally, we're in a pretty fast-moving sector. So as an outsourcer, we do what our clients don't do well. So that's what we're mandated to do. So our ability to react quickly to changing client requests and changing market conditions is really important. So one of the things, I'll give you a classic metric in our sector, that we've got 100% turnover in our labor force. So that has a pretty paramount impact on your overall financial profile, because you're always swapping out labor costs. So that's sort of the level of change that we expect. Client demands are always changing, because as an outsourcer, you're always having to fluctuate with what your client requires. And I think when you take a look at it, some of the things that we were facing within finance was we were really siloed in terms of overall financial processes. So we had some really discrete processes in terms of how we were processing things. Don't know if that was the best thing to do, but I think as we sort of continued to evolve, we got better at it. But you continue to sort of be the mouse on the wheel, moving faster and faster, and sort of that wasn't really the long-term approach to make finance successful.
Got it. Okay. Very interesting. The one piece I wanted to highlight as we think about those challenges is we looked at some research, actually from Deloitte, around opportunities for automation. You look at the back office, this is not, there's more, from a planning perspective that can go in here. But this was interesting when you look at the processes, back office processes holistically, where Deloitte was looking at opportunities to automate. High potential here, the dark orange, around a lot of the consolidate and close process, as well as sort of medium opportunity for automation, and then the white represents a lower opportunity. So you can see this across the back office. I bring that up because when we look at that traditional stewardship role and what so many companies are dealing with today, it's a record report process that is a linear and batch process. So there's, again, lots of opportunities, back to that last slide, for improvement. But if you think about this process, and this is not, this is outside of Workday today, think about how manual that can be. That is manual in terms of just transactional work, the reconciliation, that's preventing you from balancing. As you look at how can you automate, there's lots of opportunity here. This is kind of representing an 8-step process, but if you could streamline that down so that intercompany accounting was simpler, allocations and revaluations were not batched, bank reconciliation was easier, elimination entries maybe wouldn't require human intervention. These are the things that this process today outside of Workday, one of the reasons why it can be so cumbersome, but also reasons why it can be, there's lots of opportunity to automate. So when you think about your take on the future of finance, Joe, walk us through that traditional stewardship and how you see it as this record, report, and reconcile area, and how did this work specifically prior to Workday, would you say, that close process?
Yeah, so if I look at sort of the low capability, low value, so what we mean by low capability and low value means finance's capability in terms of what it needs to, in terms of the talent and the systems, those resources are relatively low. And in terms of value, what is the shareholder value that process drives? And I think, that report, reconcile, that's your traditional discrete close process, your transaction processing focus. Really what you're doing is you're racing to get the numbers done, and that is your primary mandate in the close process, right? Like, let's just get the numbers done and be done with that. What happens is you think you actually run efficient, right? So you've got this perception that you're thinking you're running efficiently because you're doing all this activity. There's a huge amount of effort, and what ends up happening is that you spend this huge amount of effort to get the numbers done, but there's no real insight. You're not providing any context. You're not providing really any real strategic value or future value to the operations team. So when you look at sort of the finance mandate overall, the way I see it is that, you've got your custodian role where you've got to manage the numbers, you've got to manage the risk, you've got to appropriately report, you've got to do all of those things, but then, where is the value driver piece? Where is the piece where you are starting to sit down with your operations, being that consultant to your operations team and helping them drive value through giving them insight, information that they can use in day-to-day decision making. So if I go back to sort of that first stage, it's, a lot of effort. We got to the finish line, we managed to close the books, but that's about it. So when you think about that, how do you begin to sort of move into the next phase? And I think, we're going to sort of talk about that in a few minutes, but I think that starts with, your baseline foundational technology in terms of what you need to invest in from both a people perspective and a system perspective.
Yeah. I think something you've also said, Joe, is that you can be really efficient in this traditional stewardship role because of the processes that you've put in place. But, what's your take on that and helping you move forward as an organization?
So you get to the numbers, right? And you believe it's an efficient process because there's lots of effort put behind it. But, is it really driving any true analysis? Is it really driving any insight? Are you really being a consultant to your business unit leaders? Are you helping them manage their business better? Because at the end of the day, it's not the decisions that are made in my office that really impact the organization's performance. It's really the individual decisions each line manager makes every day in their particular cost center or business unit or wherever they're managing. So those are the decisions. So how do you make sure that those people have the right ability to make decisions with right information? And that's really the role of finance. The finance role is really to be that conduit, to create that infrastructure that facilitates that. And the only way you do that is you begin to pull back, right, out of your traditional report, reconcile roles. And it's not that you're putting them aside. It's what you're saying is that, let's really make these processes automated so I can focus my efforts and rebuild my skills so I can deliver that operational insight to where it needs to be.
That's great. So with that said, we were in this kind of traditional stewardship role, but now what we want to take you to is this second step in where Workday is. And this is where Workday comes into play for companies that are leveraging finance, adaptive insights from a planning perspective, and then also operational insight. And with Workday today, the second part of the journey, getting out of that traditional stewardship, is setting organizations up to be organizationally agile, right? And so this is where, when you're looking at disruption, you have the data, you have the automation, and the insights to look at opportunities, to act on those opportunities. And this is where you can also see a greater balance in time spent on the transactional processing, the reporting, and the insight in that image in the center, that slow tick into a balanced approach that's leaning into more of the strategic. And so if we think about that record to report process outside of Workday today, that's focused on linear batch processing, where you're running into latency, manual error correction. This is where Workday simplifies this. and it's taking an 8-step process and whittling it down into 5. And it's also one that's done in a single cloud application versus multiple clouds that might be needed in other systems to make this up. And so just from that alone, there's tons of efficiency. And then there's innovation in the way that it was designed so that you are able to, instead of running batch processing, you're automating elimination and translation tasks. You're gaining real-time insight into consolidated financial results. You're reconciling and certifying account balances without leaving the core system of record. And so there's a period close work area. There's business processes that configure this holistically. There are close checklists. So there's all kinds of efficiencies that are layered into that transaction processing that serve up insight, that allow you to report, to achieve compliance, again, helping to articulate a greater balance from transaction processing and leaning in more towards that time spent on analysis so that you can take on more of that analysis, more of that strategic work. And so I want to ask, as we think about that organizational agility role, Bill Gosling has taken that a step forward as well. And Joe, I'd love to hear your point of view in what life is like today with Workday, what life is like today from an organizational agility perspective, and how you see that taking shape at Bill Gosling.
Yeah, and I'll walk you through a little bit about sort of the mindset before Workday and then sort of how we shifted it. So we weren't actively looking for a finance system at the time we chose Workday. What we were doing is we were actually looking for an HR system. And at the time, the finance thinking was, and being the culprit, being the leader, it was, the systems are good enough. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that, our processing efficiency was pretty decent. We could close the books pretty decent. Quality probably wasn't at the level I would have wanted to be. But reporting, via Excel, email, and so forth was pretty decent. It was, good enough. So, but you think about it in retrospect, okay, well, good enough really isn't driving my mandate, which my mandate as CFO is to, create capital, not just count it, right? So going back in retrospect, it's like, hold on a second here. What I was doing back then really wasn't fulfilling my mandate in my role. So we were out on our journey looking for a new HR system, and we had happened to our CHRO brought me into a demo, say, hey, this Workday company has financials. Do you want to take a look at it? So what intrigued me all of a sudden was overall architecture in terms of the technology, how it actually looked at data. So the way I viewed Workday was, hey, this has the potential to be an analytics system where I can actually deliver analytics, both people and financial, down to operational decision makers. And when you combine those two, for us, it's paramount, right? We're in the people business. Our biggest cost is people. We manage people actively through our business. So bringing those two together was really, really important for us. So on the finance end, what it did for us was, hey, I can actually look at data now in a multidimensional format as opposed to a linear format. So in like a lot of traditional ERPs, everything is linear, right? You've got debits and credits, and people think linear. So if you're thinking linear, you've got a linear system, you're going to deliver linear analysis. So when I was, when we were looking at it, say, hey, we can actually think multidimensionally, process multidimensionally, and then analyze multidimensionally, which all of a sudden increases the value of what the finance team can provide pretty significantly. So, for us, foundationally, we had to sort of look at, what was our structure, and we pretty much threw everything from a finance process out. And, the attitude we had going in was, hey, you know what, there's really no sacred cows here. So assuming we've done something efficiently in the past is a bad assumption to make because we really don't know. We really haven't benchmarked it against anything else. So we basically threw everything out and we re-architected our approach to what a finance system needs to do and what it needs to deliver back to the business. So if you look at some of the end result, right, where we're at right now, the biggest thing was delivering financial, human, capital, and payroll analytics back to operational decision makers and financing becoming a conduit to driving better decisions all the way through. Most of the time that the analysts spend is on that analysis and that guidance. I can tell you that within our business units, we close our books with 2 journal entries, and that's it. Everything else, from an overall system efficiency perspective is either automated, is through a business process that's automated, has steps in it, and puts the transactions through without significant human intervention. So that's sort of how we ended up where we ended up. And that's sort of our sort of level one that we've achieved, and we're sort of going to move on to level two, which I think we're going to talk about in a few minutes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, back to your point, there's a deep connection between the Workday approach to the record to report process, in that it is providing all of the tools that you need to streamline that because of the connection with the data, because of the richer analysis that's offered, that helps streamline that adds depth so that the process is more efficient. The insight is so much greater as well. Joe, you talked about the closing the books with 2 journal entries. Can you share any more detail? And then I'd love to talk a little bit more about how you're going beyond that today with Workday.
Yeah, so if I take a look at some of the other things we've achieved, like labor cost management for us is paramount, right? So our ability to course correct midstream is very important. So we do labor cost analysis on an ongoing basis, and we have also got Workday payroll. So all of our payroll and financials is integrated, so we can forecast what our labor costs are going to be before the month is done, and we know exactly what to do to manage those labor costs accordingly. So like some of the biggest results that we got out of Workday was volatility in margin management, right? So previously I would have probably had double-digit margin volatility, so you'd have a margin swing from say 30 to 40% or 40 to 50% or vice versa, and that you really didn't know till you closed the books and you finally locked down the numbers. Now our ability to contain that and have relatively small margin volatility is pretty incredible. Like we've got a very, very small range. I can predict our margins much better than I could. Like we're not a product shop. We don't have a bill of materials. We have people, and those people, obviously have unpredictable behavior, so that impacts your labor costs significantly. So we've been able to manage that a lot more effectively going forward, and that's something we never sort of factored into the ROI when we made the decision to go to Workday. I'm going to talk maybe a little about sort of the level 2 where we're at right now. So this is sort of the level 1. These are the things we've achieved. The level we're at right now is to do complete transaction processing automation. So using RPA, using OCR, having all of those processes actually work through the system where you have just human oversight, not necessarily human intervention. So that's where we're at right now, and really using some artificial intelligence to do things like estimate what your accruals are going to be. Right now we've got analysts going in and determining what year-end or month-end accruals are going to be, but actually using AI, machine learning, combining that with historic data, and using the system to predict, hey, this is what your closing accrual entries need to look like. That's sort of the level we're at right now. And again, it's taking that time, reinvesting it into your team, and actually making them a much better team in terms of what they can deliver back to the business. So if I take a look at the split of people between my transaction processing to my analysts, in the old world it would have been like 80% transaction processing, maybe 20% analysis. Now it's sort of flipped its head the other way. So that's sort of the level we're at right now in terms of how we operate as an organization.
Got it. As you think of, it sounds like the balance, the mastery of that traditional processing is sound at Bill Gosling. What are your thoughts as you think about operational data? Given the insight you have today and the focus and the better kind of oversight you have over margins, how do things like operational data with Prism and extending the power of having transactional data with planning, what does that look like for you as you go forward and investing in those areas as well?
So sort of my vision right now is when you look at something like client profitability. So in our business, we measure client profitability, we measure revenue growth, we measure margin, labor costs, and so forth. pretty straightforward. So that's one dimension of how you measure the success of that client relationship. The other dimension is the people element, right? So how successful are your people? What's your turnover? What's your ability to retain? What is your ability to promote out of that particular program that you're running for the client? Then there's other elements. There's all the operational elements. So how successful are you in meeting your SLAs? What's your quality look like? What are your competitors doing? So the way I look at it, when we look at an overall scorecard in terms of overall client health, we call it client health because that's really what it is. How healthy is your client? You can have your financial metrics, your people metrics, then you can have your operational metrics, and that's where something like Prism comes in, where you can begin to extract your operational data, bring it into one scorecard, and then you can view it in various facets, right? You can look at, hey, what do my SLAs look like for my bottom quartile of performers in terms of employees? What does it look like for the top quartile? What's the profitability look like for that particular group of employees versus the other group of employees? And that's sort of the level that we're looking at for Prism, and have that all on one dashboard, give it to an operational manager. All of a sudden, you've got a scorecard. You can see where the business is today. And then more importantly, when you look at having an integrated planning solution like an adaptive, which is what we're working on right now, bringing in what the future is going to look like tomorrow, right? Building your financial and human capital planning based on the key drivers of the business and integrating that all as one. So if you look at it, sort of what is the overall view of the business today, what's it going to look like tomorrow, and what decisions or course corrections do we need to make accordingly? So that's sort of the vision of where we see things and sort of the direction on how we're pulling it all together.
Fabulous. And as you can hear, that step-by-step approach to mastering the basics to then layer in richer data, richer analysis, this is what is helping finance teams operate on that next level of strategy. So let's continue to drill down into that vision in the future. And so we talked about the world of organizational agility, or that level 2, as Joe was talking about, that where there's active planning, operational insight, but the foundation of which is that automated transactional processing. But let's look forward, okay? And so as you master that world of organizational agility, and I think actually Bill Gosling is in between this organizational agility and continuous strategy today, but this is where Workday is really investing. And so we're able to deliver organizational agility today. Where we're going with the help of things like machine learning is expanding upon those 3 themes in greater depth. And from a record to report perspective, that falls within this intelligent automation area, where we are looking at taking processes like the record to report process and applying machine learning, which will help companies extract time across that process, automating it so that it's serving up anomalies. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Augmented insight is building upon that further and enriching information to get you to the why behind the what. So you're not having to sift through data. You're being served up that data and then looking at, let's say revenue is up. Why is it up? Is there a new sales leader? There's all kinds of variables to provide that insight. And then ultimately as well, there's a focus on predictive guidance. This is where the planning message comes in and looking at identifying the most optimal paths for growth. This continuous strategy world is where you see this inverted triangle that we talked about earlier, where the balance of time and strategy is much more significant with less time focused on transaction processing. That doesn't mean that the transaction processing is going away. It means that it's automated, it's operating more intelligently with the help of technology so that your team is focused on the analysis continuously, to continuously help drive strategy for your organization. So as we think about the record to report process that exists within Workday today, that's already allowing companies to close and report at any time so they have continuous insight into how they're performing, we envision this moving to a continuous close or even a 0-day close. And so when we think about applying machine learning, it is doing it in a way that is serving up exceptions across the period. That's essentially what the graph to the right is showing, is those anomalies across the close period that finance can handle in the moment. There's not a concept of having to wait until the period close to handle. It's continuous oversight, continuous optimization, and with that continuous insight, you are strategizing, providing guidance, and this is what will help finance become more strategic. You've got to do the groundwork. You've got to lay the right foundation to get there. But this is where you start to flip and invert that time spent on analysis and insight. And this is what will make it possible. And so if we think about what that looks like, what that could look like today in Workday, this is a concept of a controller dashboard that is showing those anomalies. And so machine learning essentially will continuously monitor process automation that then surfaces efficiencies gained over the period. It surfaces insights. So there's no black box around what the machine learning is actually doing. There's complete transparency. And so this is an example of automation across things that, humans can lean in on. And this is sort of, again, back to that point of disruption. This is what will give you the time back to focus more on that and to simplify the way that you manage your record to report process. So when we think about what the future with machine learning and other innovative technology is like for you, Joe, I'd love to hear your take on that and getting to that next level beyond where you already are today.
Yeah, and I think it's the first thing you look at when you look at transaction processing. You look at AI, RPA, machine learning. You combining all those elements, you're effectively having that entire transaction process, whether it be procurement, procure to pay, or receivables, payroll, that is going to be completely automated. That's my perspective. I think you're going to have oversight. You're going to have people with an oversight level to understand the anomalies, understand the exceptions, manage those. But outside of that, that entire process is going to go away as we know it. I think you're going to, your overall systems are going to be interlinked. You've got your financial systems interlinked with your HR systems. You're going to be looking at data different ways, right? If I look at the composition of my finance team today, very different than what it was 5 years ago. 5 years ago was a bunch of accountants with good accounting training. Right now, I've got a cross-section. I have a mix of different people. I've got people who've got sound financial accounting. I've got others who have a financial background, but they know things like Python, R. They're taking data from different systems, combining them together. Your skill sets are going to vary significantly. And how do you do that? Well, you have to have two things. You have to have a system that can handle it architecturally, right? So it has to have the ability to do that. And then you need to have your staff who've got the right skill sets in terms of where you need to go, in terms of what you need to deliver from an overall business perspective. I think the systems are going to become continually intelligent. You're going to have more and more people focusing in on analysis only, and that's going to be their sole role. The role is only going to be analysis. There's going to be very little transaction processing. And I think what you're going to have is you're going to have finance really start to branch out, because what's happened over the last sort of 20 years is that you've got these skunkworks finance teams that are hidden in marketing, hidden in IT, or hidden in production. I think finance needs to take its ownership back, and the way it does that is through some investing in some tools and beginning to expand the skill set and scope of what they can do.
Definitely. I think it's a huge shift for the entire organization as you get to this next level from a talent perspective, from a technology perspective, but all, again, orienting finance around strategy. And I think it's when you get to this level, when you can begin to lean in on that message the CEOs are pushing, which is disruption. We've got to lean in. We've got to strategize. And so these are the kind of stepping stones we see. And it sounds like very similar to how you're approaching it, Joe, at Bill Gosling as well. Okay, so what I want to do next is just walk through some of the pieces I shared in this journey to the future, the predictive guidance, automated insight, and intelligent automation, and just drill down into a little bit more around those areas. From an intelligent automation perspective, this is where we're really focusing on leveraging machine learning to help automate a lot of the back office processes. That is specifically what we focused on today is that record to report strategy, right? Helping whittle that down to get to a 0-day close. The idea behind that is, again, to extract that time, but also serve up those transaction process areas with insight. It's all about insight wherever you are in finance in the future. And so that ability to detect patterns, to show anomalies, that will help prevent those bottlenecks, and it will help make it possible to make decisions throughout the period versus just at period end, right? And so that statistic, that polling question we looked at earlier around time spent on analysis, this is the opportunity to get that time to spend properly, and technology is helping serve as the vehicle through which to do that. I showed the controller dashboard earlier, and so this is what will serve up those anomalies across that process, again, to help you take action and drill into those insights to continuously drive strategy. As you think about that next phase, and I should say actually that intelligent automation, while we've talked about it specifically for record to report, Joe also talked about efficiencies gained over procurement, over the contract to cash cycle. So it is not, only intended to be focused on the record to report process. There's lots of other use cases that will expand as we look at taking machine learning across all areas of finance in the future. Taking it one step further, as you gain the mastery over the record to report process and enriching that with machine learning, there's also the opportunity to cut through a lot of the reporting you may have had to do in other systems and really surface what we like to say is the why behind the what. What are the most important metrics you need to be looking at and monitoring continuously, as well as the context behind that. So it's not just a dashboard, but it's a dashboard and insights with intelligence. And it's also all within the same system. This is something we talk a lot about within Workday, is reporting, processes, people, data, all in the same system securely so that the people across the organization are empowered. Finance is the driver of this strategy, but it's got to serve up that insight to other areas of the business so that everyone has a stake in the strategy. Everyone can operate with greater insight. And so another example of this is a financial performance dashboard that's articulating what's happening. How is revenue growth through the period? What is the cost of revenue, and how is that performing? This is the insight we're talking about, where we're not only showing the numbers, but we're providing the context, the why, so that you immediately not only understand numerically or quantitatively how you're doing, but qualitatively, right? And this is where it can take a lot of time to get to outside of Workday, and where we're investing in the future. And then as you drill down further into this predictive guidance area, this is where we start to invest and continuing to invest in our planning capabilities with Adaptive. And so what we look to do here is serve up optimal growth paths that allow you to elect which will be most beneficial for your organization so that you're seizing opportunities, you're investing, you're course correcting. It's this sentiment of continuous guidance, but also layered in with predictiveness so that it can cascade and automate action based on that strategy. So we're trying to blur the lines between the execution and the planning, again, to drive and enable finance around continuous strategy and execution. And so, and this is an example of what that planning model could look like in the future as well, where we're looking at what can we do to drive revenue? What are the most optimal growth paths? And again, this would be, in the future, an opportunity for you to elect which plans look the best, which have been proven out from different models. And again, this is serving up data and intelligence. It's still up to the talent, and this is where the technology and talent together are so critical, is that talent has to be able to interpret this properly and to provide that guidance. And so the idea is we're empowering finance really with the information, the technology, and innovation to take it to the next level. So we talked about a lot of different things across the record to report process, how that record to report process allows and serves as the basis for so much of the future for finance. Joe, I'm curious if you had advice for companies looking to get started in optimizing the record to report process and becoming more strategically oriented, what would your advice be for the individuals that are on the phone?
Yeah, I think a couple things. You really need to shift your mindset. Like I said, in our world before, things were good enough, and good enough really doesn't cut it anymore. So it's really shifting the mindset. It's, if you're comfortable, you're really not pushing yourself. So becoming bolder in terms of what you want to do. Look at your finance team's mandate. What's my real mandate within the organization? Well, how do I fit into the strategic plan? How do I, as a finance leader, drive value within my organization? So that's one of the main things. Have the mindset of, I need to figure out how to create capital and, not just count capital. Sure, we've got our traditional stewardship roles of, you manage cash, you manage tax, you make sure things run efficiently, but how do you drive operational insight to the right people so they can make good decisions, so they can drive value for you on your behalf, and then be the facilitator of that. So you, as the conduit in finance, the good thing about being in finance is you can see the guts of the entire operation, right? You've got that ability from a scope perspective to see everything, bring it all together, and then relay it back in a way that other people can digest. So that is a leverage point that finance teams, I think, need to do. And, you need to really build your champions, build your relationships within the organization. As a finance leader, you can't do it on your own. You need to get your CEOs on board, your CFOs on board, whoever you work with on board, but also get your champions of change. So when you're embarking on this kind of a process, you really need champions of change, and you'll see them within the organizations. They're the people that adopt things quicker, faster than everybody else, who are always asking questions, who are always keen on training. Those are the people you want to adopt as your champions of change, and they can help you facilitate and really bring forward sort of the message in terms of what finance needs to do going forward and how finance wants to reinvent itself.
Fabulous. I'm going to cover a couple of key takeaways, and then what we want to do is go into Q&A because there were a few questions that came through. But what we want you to take away from today is that by transforming your back office, your operations, processes like record to report, this can set you up for more time back on the areas that are important, more empowerment, better data, better insight, better reporting, ultimately so that you are set up to drive continuous strategy and ensure that the future you are resilient, you are able to disrupt and lean in on what your CEOs are asking of you. And so with that, I want to go into a couple of questions that have come through, and they're mostly for you, Joe. The first one is, how do you see the nature of your team shifting? How will the knowledge base and skills adapt as you continue to become more and more strategic?
Yeah, so your traditional finance knowledge, your core accounting concepts, those need to be maintained, right? So that's table stakes. But what you see is, what we found was sort of the linear thinking accountants began to struggle because you're looking at data now in multidimensional format, right? So you're looking at data from different views, whether it be business unit, cost center, company, country, currency, whatever. You look at, and you're slicing and dicing data differently, so you really need to find somebody who's got that ability to pivot between those points. So that's the first thing. You begin to expand skill sets. So like I think I said earlier, that you've got finance people who have the ability to understand Python and R, right? So that's statistical programming. Well, that's important because you're bringing in different sets of data and combining them with finance data and trying to figure out what the insight is telling me. So those are sort of the couple of things, right? And then people have to be willing to change, right? So in the old world, sort of in our legacy world, it's like, okay, we're going to put a system in, it's going to sit there for 5 years, and then we'll upgrade it whenever we feel like upgrading it, when there was a release available. When you've got a system like Workday where you've got continuous innovation coming down the pipe, it forces you to innovate because there's new features and functionality that you need to be on top of. So you're always innovating. So you create an innovation mentality within finance, and that momentum carries itself. So people always have the mindset now of how do I make this process better. So every time I bring someone into a new position within finance, even if I rotate within the department itself, you find people have different ways of doing things, and they find better ways of doing things more efficiently, more strategic, and driving better outcomes.
That's great. Another question for you is, where do you start? There's a lot, that can go into something like this. How did you get started? Where do you start? And did you do a big bang approach, or was it an incremental approach for Bill Gosling?
Yes. So we did a big bang approach, and where it started was from the strategic plan. So understanding, here's the goals of our organization, where it needs to go, how it needs to grow, what are the key elements it needs to have to make sure that we as a finance team can enable that growth, right? So it started there, and it sort of didn't begin to synchronize. So I said to myself, hey, this is how we're set up right now. If we're going to go from A to B with this infrastructure, we're never going to make it, right? So it becomes a bit of an inflection point, and then you realize we're going to have to go do something bold here, because simply going in and rebuilding what we have, all it means is that all we're going to do is increase the level of effort to do the same thing over and over again. So we took the approach of ripping everything out, and then getting buy-in within the organization. Here's the approach on where I think finance needs to go. Here, I got buy-in from my CEO. We got buy-in from the operations folks. Here's what finance is going to be doing going forward, and making sure you've got that buy-in, and then you recruit your champions of change, right? Because the finance team usually, don't have enough numbers to do it yourself. You really need to go and recruit and solicit your internal change agents, which are usually not finance people.
That's great. And that actually leads to a kind of a follow-on question to that, which is, changing your financial system can sound like open heart surgery for perhaps many people on the phone. And so how did you get comfortable with the idea of this change? How did you influence that? And how did you kind of identify the options, to the team to say, we're going to replace it? And, how did you go about driving that change, given that yeah.
Yeah, you've got relatively few paths, right? Path A is just keep doing what you're doing, and assume that it's going to be able to meet the business needs going forward, right? So in my mind at the time, not an option. Doing what we're doing will not get us to the next level. Decision B is, okay, build on what you got. Well, you've got a core infrastructure here on people and technology. Do I build on this? And when you start, in our case, when we started to analyze, it's like, okay, hold on a second here. If I go build on something old, I don't know if it's going to work. So I'll give you my car analogy. I'm a bit of a car guy. So I've got an old Mercedes and I have a new Tesla. So trying to get my old Mercedes to function like my new Tesla, like, good luck. Even if I got it and I ripped it apart, it will never be able to function like my Tesla in terms of what it can do, right? So again, is that what you're going to do? Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to expend all that effort? And then, people say they're sacred cows. In my mind, there's always ways to make the excuse that there's a sacred cow, but chances are somebody's figured out a better way, or you can figure out a better way. So things like sacred cows don't exist really at Bill Gosling. And then, ultimately the decision we made was, hey, we're going to just blow it up and we're going to rebuild it, right? So how do you build a championship basketball team, right? That I'm from Toronto and everything. Well, you blow it up, which is what Toronto did last year. They fired their coach of the year. They got rid of their star player and they replaced them, right? So you blew it up and you built yourself a new championship basketball team. So that's what we did, essentially.
Fabulous. Well, and congratulations on that win in basketball. So, and I think a fitting end to our webinar for today. Joe, so appreciate you taking the time to walk through how you have really transformed the Office of Finance at Bill Gosling. We are going to continue on in this series of sharing insight into how Workday is investing and driving continuous strategy for finance. So there are a couple of other webinars that are in the asset area of the webinar. So take a look. Join us in the next webinar. We hope to see you and hear from you. And if there are other questions, please don't hesitate to submit them in the Q&A box, and we will get back to you via email, or hopefully we covered most of them in this webinar today. So thank you so much, Joe, and for all of you on the line. We hope you found it informative.
Yeah, my pleasure.